In this video, we're going to learn how to sew a button onto some fabric. And remember, the purpose of a button is to kind of hold things closed, right? So you're going to have a button, and then on the other side of something, you would make something with a buttonhole, which has kind of, a slit. So it's going to be horizontal or vertical. And that slit is going to slide up over the button, and then it will slide back behind it, and the button will kind of hold it in place, right? So that's the whole point of a button, is it's one of our closures that can hold fabric together. Another few closures that we sometimes use in sewing are a snap, which these are in large versions, right? So you usually see like a little teeny guy, but this just kind of helps you see easier what it is. And it has this little protruding node here that goes into a hole, and then they clip together, right? They hold together, and then you pull this guy off and it comes unsnapped. So when you're sewing in a snap-on, you would sew like this to one side and then this to the opposite side, and then they would go together, right? So that's one other closure. Instead of a button and buttonhole, you can do a snap, and you do one side on one and one on the other. Another option, this is called a hook and eye. So here's our hook, it looks like a hook, and this is the eye. And you most often see these on the tops of zippers for dresses or skirts, and they just kind of help the zipper to keep from going down. And the way it works is you sew this onto the top of one thing, this onto the other, or wherever you're keeping them closed. And then you can hook the eye on the hook, and it will hold things together, right? So if I'm pulling out, they hook together. So those are some of our closures that we use in sewing. Back to buttons, because that's what we're going to focus on today. In order to sew a button, you're going to need thread. We're going to sew these on by hand. So I'm using an enlarged version. You're going to use a regular size button, and you're going to use just like a little square of fabric, right? I'm just using this felt and this button and this rope kind of stuff as my thread so that you can see it a little bit easier in this video. But you're going to be doing this on a smaller scale. So for your button, you're going to want 1 arm's length of thread. So you're going to pinch the thread in one hand, and then you're going to pull it all the way up along your arm to your shoulder. Sorry, you can't see my shoulder, but I'm just holding it up to my shoulder. So this is my right hand that I'm pinching with, and going all the way to my right shoulder, and then pinching that with my left hand. This is where it was at on my shoulder, and then I would just cut it right there. Because I have such a big button, I'm going to cut mine a little bit bigger than that, but that's how big of thread you would want for you. One thing to note with thread is sometimes you're like, oh, bigger is better, right? Longer is better. It's not the case. If you go too long with thread, it has a tendency of getting tangled up, which can be really frustrating, especially when you're halfway through sewing something and then all of a sudden you get tangled. So just keep that in mind as you're sewing. You don't want to go longer. Arm length is all you need. So just start at the tip of your fingers and then go all the way to the shoulder of that same hand, same side. So either if you're doing right or left-handed, that's fine. And then that's the length of thread you want for a button. And just a reminder, I use bigger because I have such a big sample here, this big button that I'm doing. So I'm going to start by threading my needle, which is tricky with my little rope thread, but we'll see if we can get it all through. Okay, there we go. And I'm gonna pull this through. I'm gonna pinch this end of my thread. I'll find the other end of my thread, which is over here. And I'm gonna tie a knot with these two together. So here's how I tie a knot for hand sewing when I'm using 2 threads. Sometimes you just need 1 thread, and you'll tie a knot, and you'll have to be kind of careful not to lose the other side. This case, we're going to tie both together. So I'm going to take the 2 threads, and I'm going to pinch them between my index finger and my thumb. So I'm going to pinch them like that, and then using my other hand, I'm going to wrap the 2 threads around my index finger. From here, I'm going to kind of pull back with my index finger while also pushing forward with my thumb, kind of like that, like a rolling motion. So I'm going to just do that again. I'll wrap it around my index finger, kind of straighten everything out, and then I'm just going to push forward with my thumb, pull back with my index finger, right? And then I will take my middle finger on my left hand where I'm holding my threads, and I'm going to pinch it down on the threads that are pulling out. This is out to my needle, right? And using my right hand, I'll pull that forward. So I'm gonna do this all in one kind of motion, or one go. So I'll pinch these, wrap this around right up next to them. Then I'm gonna roll my fingers together, take my middle finger, put it on my thumb, and pull with my right hand to make a knot. And here you can see I kind of have like a little loop, so I'll just pull everything through my loop. Sometimes you need to help it a little bit, but that made me a really nice knot. So that's one way of tying a knot for sewing. Now I'm just gonna pinch onto my knot and I'm gonna pull my threads down so I can make sure, see how my needle's not like even out. It's like it's closer to one side of the knot than the other. So I'm just gonna pull it all the way down till it's in the center. Remember, you'll have a much smaller thread, so that's a little simpler for you. So that is threading our needle, and now we will get to our button. You have a couple of options. Some buttons just have 2 holes, and in that case, you're just gonna go back and forth, right? When you have 4 holes, you can choose if you want to do an X, or if you want to do a square, or equal sign. In this case, I'm going to do equal sign. And when you do an equal sign, it's going to make an X on the back, and I'll show you how that all works. So to get sewing, I'm going to take my knot. I'm going to make sure it's really tight, and then I'm also going to just trim down my threads so that I don't have those in my way, and you won't see those after I do my button. And I'll take my needle, and I'm going to start on the inside. I'm going to start, so this is the right side up on my fabric, right? And this is my button, and I'm actually going to put the knot on the right side up of my fabric, okay? So this is like, if I was making a shirt, this is the front of the shirt, not the inside. And I'm gonna be putting this knot right there. So I'm just gonna kind of mark where I want it, keep in mind, and I'll move my button out of the way and go through there. The reason I want the knot on the front is because my button's actually gonna hide it. It's hard to see with this button because it's so big, but your holes are tiny and you're not gonna see a little knot behind them. So your knot is also tiny. So that's one way of doing that. So then I'll just put this on top so I can keep everything straight. And I'm just gonna kind of put it on the inside corner of this hole. And then I will flip everything over. So this is like the back side of my fabric. And I'm gonna go diagonal because if I'm gonna do equal sign on the front, you're gonna have to do an X on the back, and I'll show you about that. So I'm gonna go diagonal, and I can kind of feel my hole right here. So I'm gonna go right on the inside of my hole. I'm gonna push it through, flip over, and pull this out. Okay, and I'll kind of straighten this up because the first few stitches through, everything's gonna get messed around until there's a couple stitches to hold everything together. So since I'm doing equal sign, I'm gonna do my top equal sign first, right? So I went this way, I'd be doing an X. If I went this way, I'd probably be doing like 2 parallel lines this way, or a square, and I'm doing the equal sign. So I'm just gonna go across. I'm gonna go into my corner of my hole here for my equal sign and push that through. You can see here when I flip that over that there's like a loose thread, and I'm just gonna go ahead and pull these threads on this side so that that tightens up. So as you go, just kind of watch for loose threads and tighten them up as you go. It's a lot easier to do as you go than it is at the end. So I'm gonna pull those through, and that starts my equal sign. You can see here, right, I have a little one on the top, and you can still see my knot right there because I haven't gone over that part yet. Now I complete my X. So I have one diagonal line, and I'm gonna go to the other diagonal. So I'm gonna go across that way, and I'll pull through on the front. So I have a complete X on the back, and now I'm going to complete my equal sign on the front by going over one hole. And I come out, you can notice, since I'm going in the same hole and I've tried to keep everything lined up, I'm coming out almost at the exact same point on the back, which is what you want. You want it to be very, very clean looking. You don't want to have threads everywhere, right? So we're gonna try and keep as close as possible to that. Now I'm going to go continue my X, so I'm just going to go back over here, which will bring me to the top left corner again, where I can start all over. You can see. And you can see some of these are getting a little loose, so I need to make sure I'm pulling everything tight as I go. That being said, you don't want everything to be super, super tight. So you need to leave a little bit of space for the buttonhole, right? Because that's going to go in between this fabric and the button. So you need to have a little raised up space where that can go. In order to do this, I'm going to use a pin, or in this case, I'm going to use a nail because I have such a big button, but you would use a pin. And I will just slide it through my little equal sign right here. And that's just going to keep a gap going so I can pull everything nice and tight and neat as I go, but it will keep a little gap where I can pull it out at the end and have a little space for a layer of fabric to go in between my button and buttonhole, or button and fabric. Okay, so I'm just going to continue sewing as normal with this pin, or this nail, which you would have a pin in there. So I'm going to continue my equal sign by going over right there, and I'll pull that through. Continue my X on the back by going diagonal, which brings me to the bottom left corner. Just make sure everything's pulled tight as I go. And then I'm going to go complete my equal sign. So I've done 2 equal signs now. I want to do a few more just so I make sure everything, oh, this guy's really stuck, is really, really on there, right? You don't want your buttons falling off. It's no fun to lose a button. Okay, so I'm just going to make sure that's all tight, and I'll continue my X, just going diagonal. Trying to keep everything as neat as possible. Continue my equal sign, going across the top, coming out the back. And you can see I kind of came a little bit away. It's still pretty close in line, like when I do the line, it'll all become one X. But you just kind of want to watch for that kind of thing as you're sewing to keep everything neat. Because if you're not careful, you can get stuff coming out all over. And that won't put your button in the right spot. It also will not just look as neat. And remember to keep pulling everything tight as you go. So I'll pull these on the back and you can kind of see them come out. Then I'm ready to continue pulling this guy out. So I can do my equal sign, making sure the back looks good. So that's my 3rd equal sign I've done. I might just do one more to keep it really strong. And depending on what you need the button for, that depends how many times you're going to go around, right? That determines, I guess, how many times you're going to go around. Because if it's kind of just a for show button and it's not holding anything on, then you don't need it to be as tight. But if it's like holding your pants up, you really want to make sure that button's not coming off, right? So I'm just going to finish my equal sign one last time. And I'm going to pause here for a second. Instead of continuing through, what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to go back through the fabric. I'm just going to go over a little bit. Go back through the fabric. But this time, instead of going through the button, I'm just going to go in between the button and the fabric. So I'll pull that out here. And this is where I'm going to do what's called a shank. The shank is going to lift up the button a little bit so there's a space for the buttonhole to go in. And that's why I had this pin here, or this nail, because that kind of was reserving that space that I was going to add later. So I'm going to pull that out so I can do my shank. And you can kind of see this button's a little looser now, right? Okay, so I'm going to leave it like that. Sorry. And then I'm going to pull my shank. I'm going to wrap this thread. So I'm going to hold it right here. I'm going to wrap it around 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times. And then I'm going to tie it off. Mine's a little bit long, or short for that. So I put my shank around, and at first it's kind of all just laying like one wrapped around the other, wrapped around the other, and I don't want it to spread out this way. I want it to kind of lift my button up. So one way to kind of do that is to just kind of pull this out, and then you just kind of pull on you're pulling the fabric out. So you're separating the fabric and the button, and you're just kind of pulling on this thread. You can see, and it kind of loose helps you see, it helps everything become more vertically raised instead of just like spreading out horizontally. And I'm just gonna kind of pull on the loose stuff till I can get it all tight here. Sorry, there's probably lots of background noise from the button hitting the table. I'm just gonna keep pulling until I can get that all tight. So I went around 5 or 6 times, and that kind of gives me the raise. Because your button is so much smaller, it's not gonna have as many of these wrinkles. This one just has wrinkles because I'm taking like a 4-inch square and trying to make it all in one little circle, or you're gonna be taking like an 1/8 of an inch square and trying to make it one little circle, which is gonna gather your fabric a lot less. So anyways, now that I've pulled that all tight and I have this gap, you can see that's my shank right there. That's raising my button up off my fabric. That's what I was trying to do there. Now that I have my shank, or that gap from the shank there, I'm gonna go ahead and tie a little knot. So I'll just take a little bite of fabric. And it's hard because I'm running out of thread. But I'm gonna go through, and then I'm gonna loop. I have a loop here. If I pull here, then my loop's gonna get smaller. But before I can make my loop smaller, I'm gonna put my needle back through to create my knot. So I'll do that once, and then I'm gonna do a little bite again in the same area through the threads. Do my bite, and then I'll go back through the loop again. So I have my loop. I'm gonna take my needle back through to tie off a knot. Now I have my knot tied. I can make sure it's really, really strong, and then I'm gonna go ahead and trim it so that everything looks nice and neat, like that. And now I have a button.